What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a video on a few games I think are worth getting the 100% on. Games that I think that achievement metric or level of play really adds to the experience in some form or fashion. That said, right here at the beginning of the video, I'm fully aware that there are people who are never interested in 100%ing any game, and fair enough. I think playing games in the way in which you enjoy them is more important than anything else. But these are games where I think, again, it adds something to the experience. Or at the very least, it's just a really good time. And because of that, it can be easy for a list like this to simply become a list of your favorite games, but for me that's not really the case. For an example, my favorite game, Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, is certainly not a game I would ever recommend anyone try to 100%. It is a pretty brutal endeavor, as a matter of fact. So for this list, I tried to pick some games I haven't talked about too much, outside of one or two exceptions really, since the last time I made a video like this, which was all the way back in June of last year, I believe, and needless to say I've 100% a lot more games since then. So with that in mind, let's jump into it and start talking about it. Kicking it off with a more recent entry with Armored Core 6. While this might seem somewhat obvious to a lot of people, I will say that while I am familiar with FromSoft's various Soulsborne games, FromSoft has actually made a ton of different games, and many of them I'm a bit less familiar with. For instance, the Armored Core series, which means when the most recent one, 6, came out, I was a little hesitant to pick it up because I didn't know what to expect really. Mech battlers aren't usually my thing, and I will say that I was very pleasantly surprised by Armored Core 6, and while I think that also echoes the general sentiment, this is a game that I think you get more out of by simply doing all of it, as there are multiple endings to the game based on the New Game Plus and the options you choose that open up in the New Game Plus modes that flesh out the story and lead to a more interesting narrative. And that, combined with some really big set pieces and some really well done combat, really makes for a game that you get the most out of if you manage to do everything it has to offer. And because of that, while being, again, very hesitant to pick this up at first, it was a real treat to 100%, and I would definitely recommend more people do the same. Now, second up on our list here, we have a game that I'm very happy to add to the ranks, and that is actually Cyberpunk 2077. I doubt there's much I could tell you in this video that you don't already know. Following the game's very poor launch, a long-winded redemption arc that took about 3 years and ended quite recently with the launch of its one and only DLC, Phantom Liberty, that brought all sorts of overhauls and changes to the game that make it, in my opinion, a great game now. The city feels alive, the combat feels fun, and while I've made videos on exactly what those changes are, re-reviewed the entire game as a matter of fact, on top of the DLC specifically, in case you happen to want to know my full thoughts, ultimately it's just a lot of sweeping changes to that game that make the entire city feel alive, all of which makes the act of getting 100% on Cyberpunk very enjoyable, and that is as someone who did it when it first launched, and again, actually, with all of these recent updates and changes. Number 3 on our list is the sort of mandatory CRPG that I have to mention as a person, and that is Wasteland 3. I've played many CRPGs, I enjoy a great many of them, it is my favorite genre, but I admit that many of them are difficult, let's say, to 100%. However, Wasteland 3 is one that I really think it is worth your time. It's a ton of fun, there's tons of endings, a lot of reactive choices, and these days, with the game finished, so to speak, with all the DLC out, all the updates and bug fixes that you could want all bundled in there now, makes for an experience that is well worth your time and is actually rewarding to 100%. And it's also a game that manages to be fun the entire time as well. Many times I was just wanting to see how enemies would react to a given situation when I did one action versus another along the game's many story routes, and that for me was a lot of the fun, on top of puzzling out the secret ending, if you will, or the most difficult to get ending, which is sort of bringing peace to the wastelands of Colorado. And all of that is to say nothing of the game's really fascinating place in video game history when it comes to the Wasteland franchise, and its long wait for a sequel via Wasteland 2 that then ultimately led to this game. So on top of just being a really great game that's fun to play, there's a genuinely interesting history there as well that I think is worth looking into. But that aside, the game is just a joy to play, which makes it a joy to 100%, which is why why, even these days, Wasteland 3 is often a game that gets recommended to beginners in the genre because it is such a fantastic place to start. But that brings us to number 4 on our list with The Ascent, a sort of cyberpunk action RPG with a really remarkable world to tear through. While this game, not unlike Cyberpunk 2077, also had a lot of bugs and issues on its launch, these days, with a lot of that stuff cleaned up, it manages to be an action-packed, destruction-laden jaunt through this cyberpunk dystopia, which is really what we all want from our cyberpunk games, I imagine, but that on top of the various builds you can make that allow you to punch through all sorts of cybernetically enhanced enemies is all really highlighted by the city itself. What is genuinely remarkable to me about The Ascent is the game world in particular. It is just packed to the brim with an incredible amount of detail that makes it feel really lived in a way that games like this typically don't manage to pull off. With my only real complaint these days being that I wish there was simply more of it to enjoy. More side content, more interesting side quests that explore some of the lore, things like that. And that's something the DLC Cyber Heist actually did a really good job with. So because of that, the fun combat, the really interesting world that they fleshed out here, I really enjoyed my time with The Ascent. I think it's absolutely worth playing to 100%, especially since the entire thing only took me a little over 20 hours personally, so it's also fairly nice on your time. But that does finally bring us to our last entry on the list, and this is Weird West, an isometric immersive sim that I quite frankly don't think gets talked about enough, especially since it was made by one of the founders of Arcane Studios, which are themselves known for their immersive sims. This game takes place in a supernatural imagining of the Wild West, where we fight and claw our way through an anthology of sorts of stories that then culminate towards the end of the game in a way that wraps them all together. For each part of the story, you'll be taking control of a specific character going on a journey of sorts through the Wild West, interacting with all sorts of supernatural elements. One of them is a pigman, another one is a werewolf, just to give you some examples of what to expect. And while each of them has their own abilities and things they can lean into, you're largely free to explore and approach situations how you want, via from stealth or sneaking or setting up elaborate ways to interact with the environment, as immersive sims happen to be known for, all makes for an incredibly enjoyable experience that is, due to its isometric nature, probably not quite like anything I've ever played otherwise. It's genuinely one of those games that kind of blends things together in a way that, while technically not new, still manages to feel very unique. And because of that, exploring the map, interacting with all these environments and enemies, playing around with the options, etc., was an incredibly satisfying experience, and it was one of my favorite games the year it released in 2022. So these days, with the definitive edition released, alongside several new gameplay modes that have launched since then, there really isn't a better time to jump into this one, especially if you're looking for something to play over the holidays. You should definitely keep this one on your radar. It is absolutely worth the time investment. That is pretty much going to wrap it up for this sort of renewed list of games that I think are worth the 100% should you enjoy that type of gameplay. That said, I would certainly love to know what games you really enjoyed getting 100% on, or just really enjoyed in general, and what sort of experiences those things may have added to your own personal knowledge of video games. Which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.